There's something magical about the thought of a cabin in the woods, tucked away on a snowy evening with a wood stove going, insulated from the elements and the commotion of everyday life. I think this desire lives in all of us. It certainly lives in me, to the point where I wanted to have a cabin anywhere I went. So rather than building 100 cabins across the state of Alaska, I decided to build a mobile cabin, something that could withstand negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, high winds, and the rigors of the road. I hope this video inspires you, the way that others have inspired me. So let's turn back the clock a year to the spring of 2024, where this whole thing began. The first order of business was finding a trailer that would fit my needs. I decided to go with this deck-over trailer that measures 16 by 8 and it has two 3,500-pound axles on it. Now keep in mind, even though it has 7,000 pounds of axle weight, that doesn't include the weight of the trailer itself. So the trailer usually eats up at least 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of steel, and that comes out of your 7,000-pound payload. So the leftover weight for building a cabin is about 5,500 pounds, if I'm being kind of conservative. Next up was getting this thing leveled out. When I was disconnecting the trailer from the truck, I happened to look down at the coupler and noticed that it was only rated to 5,000 pounds. So clearly at some point this trailer had been hodgepodged together by somebody, and I looked up underneath it and realized that the deck was totally different from the axles. Luckily the axles were brand new and are 3,500 pounds, but with a coupler rating of only 5,000 pounds, that just means I lost 2,000 pounds of payload on this trailer. That only leaves me 3,500 pounds to build a cabin with. And this is the moment that I realized I had a pretty serious problem on my hands. As you can see, the 2x4 doesn't sit flush on top of the deck boards at all. In fact, it bows down pretty significantly in the center, leaving about an inch gap. Not only was the center of the trailer sagging, but I realized that the side rails weren't level either. They kind of bowed up in some places and sloped down in other places. This whole trailer was just kind of out of whack, and I was going to have to figure out some way to fill in all the gaps and cracks in order to have a level building surface to start on. I kind of figured I'd just build the floor, and that way I could see exactly where the gaps and cracks were and figure out a way to fill them in. And of course the very first nail that I drove split the 2x4. I was pretty upset about that, considering I spent a little extra money on the premium studs, so I decided I was going to have to pre-drill and screw in every single corner of this entire cabin. Another big difference with building on a trailer rather than on a normal foundation is that you really want to anchor everything down the best that you can. You're going to be driving down the road with this thing at 60 miles, maybe even 70 miles an hour, plus the wind coming at it could be over 100 mile an hour sustained winds. It's essentially like a hurricane at all times that this thing's traveling. So I wanted to bolt the actual floor down to the steel of the trailer to make sure it wasn't going to go anywhere. With the outline of the floor built and all my holes pre-drilled for later bolting down, it was time to try to level this thing out by using a 1-inch piece of foam. I thought if I put the foam down and then put carriage bolts through the floor, I could crank it down really tight on the areas that I needed to absorb a little bit of room between the deck and the floor. And of course, having more insulation in your floor is never a bad thing, especially one that goes underneath the floor joist, so that way it'll really cut down on the thermal bridging effect. I also realized that I picked a really stupid place to put my carriage bolt.
Stupid.
In my previous build videos, I still made lots of mistakes, but I never really took the time to film them or include them in the videos. I didn't really think it was necessary, but the more I do this, the more I think it's important for people to see the struggles and mistakes that I do make, so you guys can learn from them, and also not to get discouraged when you do run into problems yourself. In addition to the 6 carriage bolts that I put up and down along the edges of the frame, I also put 2 of these Timberlock screws in every single one of the floor joists. I did not want this thing blown off in the wind. One of the biggest problems about working with foam board insulation is that when you cut it, it makes a huge mess. It sends bits of foam flying everywhere and it looks like you're inside of a snow globe. Well, I finally figured out a trick by just taking my jigsaw blade and flipping it around backwards so that the back of the jigsaw was actually doing the cutting rather than the saw blade. And man, it made a huge difference. The key to building a really strong floor that's never going to squeak on you is gluing around the edges and screwing it down. So I use this liquid nail wood glue along all the edges of the joist. I also undersized all my foam by about 1 inch on all sides so that I could add an expanding foam into the cracks. That way this stuff would really lock in and create an airtight seal around the entire thing. In an effort to cut down on as much weight as possible, I framed the floor at 24 inches on center, and I used a 3/8 plywood instead of your usual 3/4 inch plywood for the decking. I gotta say, I was pretty nervous that I'd have a flexy floor, and sure enough, it was more flexy than I wanted it to be. But the rigid foam in between definitely helps bridge the gaps, so I really don't think it'll be a problem once I put the 1/4 inch flooring in on top of this. With the 1 inch foam underneath and then the 2 inch and 1.5 inch pieces filling the voids, I figured out that the R value would be about R20 all told for the floor. Not too shabby for a little tiny cabin. I debated for a really long time about what size lumber to use for wall framing. Initially I was going to try to use 2x3s to save weight, but in the end I ended up going with 2x4s. The 2x3s only come in 8-foot lengths, and I was going to need some longer pieces to make ridge boards. The other thing about 2x3s is that they're really crappy pieces of lumber, and finding straight true ones is a real pain in the butt, especially when you're trying to buy 40 or 50 of them for a cabin. The maximum height for a trailer that's legally allowed to be on the road is 13.5 feet. While I'm going to come way in under that given my whole setup, I didn't want to come anywhere near that point, so I decided to go with 6-foot walls to give the cabin a little bit shorter look and make sure that I was going to make it under any of the bridges that I might come across along the road. The biggest rough opening that I have for windows and doors on this cabin was only going to be about 4 feet, so I built a 2x6 header out of a couple of 2x6s, a 1/2-inch piece of plywood, glue, and some screws. All right. If you've seen my other videos before, you're probably wondering why we're building this cabin in town and not at our off-grid cabin. And the answer is that our daughter was just born this spring, and so we wanted to be in town with our in-laws, close to doctors and hospitals, and it just felt like the right thing to do rather than be off in the woods with the newborn. But what's funny is that I never would have thought to do a project like this unless I wasn't going to be able to be out at the cabin, where I'd normally do all my building projects. So in the end, I'm thankful the way things worked out. By the time you start nailing down your double top plates, the walls really start to firm up, and you get a good feel for how things are going to look inside. If you notice, I didn't build the cabin over the entirety of the 16-foot trailer. That's because I wanted a 4-foot porch to overhang the back of it, so that I had somewhere to sit and store firewood and give it a nice cabin look. So the total dimensions of the actual cabin are only going to be a 12x8, even though the trailer is a 16-foot. With rain coming up in the forecast, I really wanted to get a tarp over the top of this thing so I didn't have to worry about it getting wet. So I put this temporary blocking up so I could put my ridge beam in just to have enough of a pitch to tarp it so the rain would run off to the sides rather than pooling up in the middle. I'll admit I really miss being out at my cabin doing a project like this, but I feel fortunate that I'm able to work on this while I am in town. Alright. Little did I know a lot of rain was coming, and wind too, and that rain and wind worked itself up underneath the tarp and into the cabin, soaking my newly built subfloor, which caused it to mold. In a total panic and pouring rain, I went out and staked the tarp out the best I could, added some 2x4s to the ridge beam to give more pitch to the tarp, and started spraying bleach on all the mold that I could see. I also added a couple of box fans to try to get some air circulating to try to dry this stuff out and stop the growth of the mold. When the rain finally stopped, I looked at the weather and saw that I only had a 3-day window before the rain was going to come back. I knew I absolutely had to get a roof on this over the next 3 days before the weather rolled in and ruined my project any more than I'd already had. Underneath the bottom plates of my walls, you could see that things are still pretty wet. This was not an encouraging sign for the rest of the cabin. This is going to be one of those days. In all the previous cabin builds that I've done, I would put some kind of sheeting like OSB or plywood directly onto the studs, then wrap that with Tyvek, followed by some kind of siding, usually a rough cut spruce lap siding. But in this one I decided to go with the Tyvek directly to the studs for a couple of reasons. The first and most important is that I needed to save weight, so I didn't want to put down sheeting, some kind of Tyvek, and then have to cover that entire thing up with siding. That would be way too much weight for this tiny trailer. So instead I'm starting with the house wrap and then putting T111 directly on the top of that. I realized I had totally forgotten to nail in this sill plate when I was framing out the walls.
Oh no. Shoot.
Typically, you'd want to use overlapping top plates to tie your walls together, but in this build, my top plates have to extend out over the porch to have some overhang, so instead I used these mending plates to make sure that they weren't going anywhere.
Got it.
That's a miss. You want to see if I missed to the left or the right?
You're on the window, so you actually didn't hit close to anything.
Oh,
Yeah.
right. Okie doke, that makes a lot of sense.
I'll admit I was pretty disappointed with the progress I made in one day. I only had 2 days left to get this roof done, and that rain was on its way. But lucky for me, my good buddy Forrest was willing to come over and help me get this roof put on before the rain hit. If you guys don't know Forrest, he's the one who helps me make all the music for the channel. It's all original, we write and record most of it at the cabin, and it's for sale on my website at alaskacabinadventures.com. I can't thank him enough for the awesome contributions he makes to this channel. It really wouldn't be the same without him.
Nice and flush.
Yep, it's in there.
Now that I finally had all the walls done, I could get started on the roof. And let me tell you what, cutting rafters is not an easy thing. If you're off with your calculations by just one little thing that you didn't consider, all of a sudden none of the rafters want to fit at all, and it turns into a big nightmare and a lot of wasted 2x4s. I didn't film it because I got so frustrated, but I actually cut probably 7 or 8 rafters wrong before I finally got one that seemed like it wanted to fit. I realized what the problem was is that the ridge beam I had put up was the wrong height, so no matter how hard I tried to make a 612 pitch rafter, it wasn't going to fit at the top of that ridge beam. Finally, I pulled that ridge beam down, built new supports for it, and put it back up. I do regret not filming that, because I really wanted to show you guys the struggles someone like me has while building a cabin. But after all, I was in a serious time crunch, so I just put the camera down and got it done. A big revelation I had was finding these brackets that will help you hang your rafters from the ridge beam. They're structural and they really make it easy for putting it up there. That way you don't have to try to hold it in the exact right spot while you nail it in with the nail gun, and they'll accommodate almost any angle that you choose to cut your rafters at. Obviously, wind is going to be a huge factor with this build. I can expect 100-mile-an-hour winds consistently with this cabin, considering that it's going to be going down the road at 60 miles an hour, plus whatever wind is coming at it. So I wanted to make sure that the other end of the rafters were really well anchored into the walls. I use these 6-inch long Timberlock lag screws through the butt of every single rafter. That goes through the rafter and through both the top and bottom wall plates. That way the roof can't rip off the walls unless it takes the walls with it. Let's see here. I know it's supposed to be 73 1/4, but in fact it is 72 1/4. Yeah, that's the problem. By the time I was getting close to finish with these rafters, I looked up and noticed that the blue skies were gone, and that the leaves were starting to blow in the wind. I was totally exhausted from building for the last 3 days straight, but I knew I had to get this done, and I knew I was running out of time, so I kept at it. If you notice, my rafter tails don't have any overhang on them. They're cut plumb with the walls. The reason for this is that in order to be street legal, this structure has to be under 8 foot 6 inches wide. The cabin's already 8 feet wide, and the sheeting takes up another inch, so I'm only left with 5 inches total, which means 2.5 inches on either side of the cabin for any kind of overhang. So instead of putting any overhang on the eaves, I might just have the sheet metal roofing overhang by a couple inches on either side to try to maximize that 8 foot 6 inches that I'm allowed.
It's gonna be fun.
When it was finally time to start putting the decking on the roof, 2 things happened. One, the first drop of rain hit my arm. The second was that my good friend Brandon just happened to be in the neighborhood and was willing to help me pound this thing out before the rain really started to pour.
Here, I'll hand you the other ones. You can fold them over the center. Straight box.
On a typical roof, you'd want to leave something called a ridge vent to make sure that the moisture that gets up into your ceiling has a place to escape. You'd leave your eaves open and about an inch gap underneath your insulation to make sure that the air could be pulled from the eaves up to the ridge and escape out through the ridge vents. That way you don't get moisture in your ceiling, causing mold and rot and different things like that. But this little cabin on wheels, you can't do that. You have to close up all the possible entryways into the roof so that wind doesn't blow snow and rain up into your roof from the eaves and the ridge vent. So I decided to put Grace Ice and Water Shield over the entire roof and even overlap the edges so that way it couldn't get up in between the crevices between the roof and the walls. And I'll tell you what, it wasn't a second too soon.
Right on. Thanks, dude. More. Yes. All right. 100%.
I can't tell you just how relieved I felt to have the roof on right in the nick of time for this rainstorm. Now I can take my time getting things finished without having to worry about impending weather ruining everything I've worked for. I also really can't tell you how thankful I am for the people in my life who are willing to come out and help me out. Because at the end of the day, a cabin is just a thing. It's just a box made out of wood. But the memories that you make with the people that you build it with are the things that are truly valuable and last a lifetime. I've managed to avoid having to cut sheet metal roofing in all my other structures by just planning out my rafters to be a full 8 or 10 foot length. But on this build I didn't have that luxury. I wanted to try to stack as many pieces together as I could so I don't have to make so many cuts. But using this little hand grinder, that proved to be more difficult than I anticipated. Speaking of more difficult than anticipated, I actually have a pretty tough time asking people to subscribe to my channel. I know I personally get a little bit tired of YouTubers constantly hounding you to subscribe to their channel, so I really try to avoid it at all costs. But I realize that I never even say it at all. But this time I'm putting myself out there and saying, if you guys are feeling like it, please subscribe. It really does help me out and it means a lot. Not only was I dissatisfied with how straight this grinder was cutting, it was also burning through my DeWalt batteries really fast. I could only get through about a sheet and a half before I'd have to put in a new 3-amp battery. This meant it was going to take all day just to charge up the batteries and cut through all these pieces of sheet metal. And then this happened. It was clear that if I wanted to get this job done anytime soon, I was going to need a different tool.
So much better.
If there's one thing I've learned about doing sheet metal roofing, it's that you definitely want to pre-drill all your holes before you put it up there. For one thing, it just makes it so much easier for the screws to bite and punch through, but it also gives you a nice even pattern all the way across the whole roof. It's imperative that you get the first piece totally square and perfect when you put it up. Otherwise, all the other pieces will slowly start to work their way out of square as you get to the other side. Rather than just lining up the front edge, I actually measured the overhang to make sure that it was equal on the left side and the right side, and then went ahead and started tacking in the rest. Normally I wouldn't put this much effort into really sealing up every nook and cranny of a roof, but thinking about this cabin going down the road at 60 miles an hour with rain and road spray coming up at it, I wanted to make sure that water couldn't work itself in through the top of the ridge cap either. So I found this stuff called roof enclosure foam. It's actually kind of tricky to find, and most of the people at the lumberyard won't even know what you're talking about, but it's specially designed to fit over top of these ribbed roofing panels. Underneath it, you're supposed to put down this butyl tape, which actually I decided in the end was kind of a bad idea. The stuff's like putty, it's really hard to work with, and I ended up having to scrape some of it off anyway since it wasn't lined up exactly where it needed to be for the ridge cap. Once I had the roof all buttoned up, I decided I really wanted to take this thing for a test drive, just to see if it would even make it down the road.
Let's see if this thing will even drive. All right. Well, here goes nothing.
I have to say I was actually really impressed with how this thing rolled. It had a little bit of wind resistance once you hit 55 miles an hour, but that's to be expected considering I have a frickin' wall behind me. But overall it towed great, stayed stable, and the whole cabin didn't seem to rock or bounce around at all. All my carriage bolts stayed nice and tight, and I think this thing actually might be roadworthy when it's all done.
$67.5.
18 by 27. I marked where I wanted the top of the windowsill to sit on the stud, but then I made a stupid mistake and put the sill on the top of that line instead of on the bottom of it. These types of little mistakes can cost you a lot of time and effort. That's why you don't do stupid stuff like that. Stupid. I spent a lot of time debating what to finish the exterior of the cabin with. Obviously, I needed it to be pretty well protected from all the elements that the road would throw at it. So I settled on this product called Penafin. It's a penetrating oil and it says it's supposed to do exactly what I want. I figured this is something I'll have to reapply at least once a year, and I might even have to do something like a varnish over the top of it if this doesn't do the job. I realized after seeing the viscosity of this stuff that it would have been better to put it in like a garden sprayer and spray it on rather than roll it on, but I'd already started down this path, so I went ahead and finished it. It went on pretty easy, and after 20 minutes you can apply a second coat, which is what I did. I have to say that I'm not a big fan of a lot of stained colors. They end up turning things kind of an orange look, and I don't really like that. So I went with a clear transparent, and even just that really brought out the wood grain and did kind of give it a more yellowed orange look. It did fade a little bit after a couple of days, but I was pretty pleased with the overall appearance of it when it was done. With the exterior stain finished, it was time to get this thing wired in preparation for insulation. So I had my friend Mason fly up from the lower 48 to help me out. He's an old high school buddy, and if you've seen my other build videos, you know that he's the one who comes up and does the wiring on all my other cabins. So I thought I'd bring him up again and we'd have a good time pounding in some wires. But before we could do that, I had to do some backtracking and cut out all the Tyvek from the stud cavities that I'd worked so diligently to put in the first place. I decided to have this cabin spray foam insulated rather than standard fiberglass insulation or even rigid foam board, and I'm doing it for a few reasons. First, and probably the biggest reason, is that spray foam insulation soaks into the wood and locks all the framing together in a way that other insulation doesn't, so it'll make this cabin really, really strong. I definitely skimped as much as I could on sheathing and framing materials to try to make it as light as possible, so I was a little bit worried about its structural strength when it came time to going down the road. So I think that having this spray foam insulation is going to make it so much stronger and more sturdy. It's also warmer than any of the other insulations. You can get up to R20, I think even R22 in 2x4 walls. And I have to admit, the thought of having someone just come in and spray foam this thing and not having to do any of the insulating really sounded appealing to me. But like I said, the spray foam really has to soak into the wood in order to do its thing. So that means I had to cut out all this Tyvek. You also want to have all your plumbing and wiring done before that happens so you don't have to drill out around it. I cut out some leftover pieces of the ice and water shield from the roof to put on the bottom of the sills. This way any water that worked itself down behind the windows wouldn't pool up and ruin the framing underneath them. I ended up having custom windows made for this cabin. Not only did I have very specific sizes that I wanted, but it had to be tempered glass. Any structure that's going to go down the road legally has to have tempered glass installed for safety. Tempered glass is not only stronger than regular glass, but if it does break, it breaks into tiny little round pieces rather than big sharp shards. They were a bit pricier than I would have liked, and it took a long time for the order to come through, but I am convinced that it was the right choice in the long run.
Got it.
Okay. There we go. Perfect. Okay. I ended up with a couple of leftover pieces of sheet metal roofing and decided that it might look pretty good as some siding along the bottom edge of the cabin. This would help protect from road grime and rocks and things shooting up at it without too much extra added weight. One of the most commonly asked questions I get is how I get power into my cabin, and the answer is actually really simple. All you need is something called an inlet box. It's basically just an electrical box that instead of being an outlet, well, it's an inlet, and it just receives a standard 3-prong electrical cord, and from there the power runs straight to all the different outlets and lights. So all you need is a generator or a power station like the EcoFlows that I like to use, and you plug directly into that and voila, power goes to the whole cabin. And since I'm using this EcoFlow power station, which has built-in circuit breakers, I don't have to have any sort of panel in between for it to be safe.
Alright, moment of truth. Alright. Thanks, Mason. Whoo!
I guess perfect will do just fine in this case.
Well, I'll hit that back again. Well, it's going to be lit up nice in here.
Yeah.
To power this bunkhouse, I'm going to be using this EcoFlow Delta 2 Max. If you guys are interested in it, there's a link down in the description. I think you guys will find a lot of use for it for any kind of off-grid situation. The plan is to have a small kitchen with one of those little RV ovens that also has 3 burners on top. I wanted to run this propane line through the wall so that I could store the bottle for it out on the porch. I did a lot of thinking about what's really holding down the whole cabin to the trailer. And while the floor is definitely bolted well to the steel frame, what's attaching the walls to the floor exactly? And I realize it's a few things. The first is just the nails that go through the bottom plate into the floor, but those have almost no holding strength. The next and most important thing is probably the fact that the exterior sheeting reaches down from the walls into the floor. And that's a really strong connection, especially if you use a lot of nails. That's exactly the kind of strength that sheeting has to offer. The last thing is that the spray foam insulation will glue all of the walls down to the bottom plate, and then that bottom plate I added these extra timber lock screws in to make sure that it wasn't going anywhere. So between all those things, I think there's a pretty good shot that it won't fly off in the wind.
Alright.
Whew! Finally, it was time to convert this plywood box into an actual cabin on wheels. It's funny how the only real difference between a really ugly little shed and a beautiful cabin is what you do with the exterior siding. The style that I really like is called board and batten, and I use live edge spruce slabs to get it done. You can get them for really cheap, and they just give a really nice, rustic look to whatever building you're doing. I did this on my main cabin, my bunkhouse, my shed, and my sauna, so I figured I might as well make the whole family match and have this with the same style. This time I wised up and decided to use this paint sprayer rather than try to roll the paraffin on. I'd say that's one of the biggest differences with this build versus all my other ones, is that I finally am taking the time to get things looking right. I usually just am in such a hurry and overwhelmed with the gravity of the project that I sort of rush things, and if something doesn't quite fit right, I just say, well, whatever, I'll cover it up with trim later on. But this project was a chance to take my time, settle down, and get things right. And if they weren't right the first time, I'd undo it and make it right the second time. Because at the end of this, I really want to be proud of it. I want to look back and say I did the best job that I could with the skills that I had then. For around the windows, I wanted something special, so I decided rather than buying ready-made trim, I figured I'd make my own out of the live edge boards that I had. Now this is pretty tricky because live edge isn't like the same width all the way across, so if you're going to make those 45s meet at the ends, the boards need to be the same width, otherwise the bark isn't going to meet up in the corners and it's going to look pretty shoddy. So I took my time to make sure that everything was measured out just right and all my cuts were as good as I could get them, and voila! Came together just how I hoped, and I'm not afraid to toot my own horn on this one and say that this looks pretty awesome. It occurred to me that I couldn't finish up the siding until I had the boxes built on the porch that I wanted, so I knew how to side around them. I didn't want to have to do some siding and then decided that I want my box at a different height, so I just went ahead and built these boxes first. I figure now's a good time to go ahead and talk about the elephant in the room. Yes, I stole this box design from Mr. Tim Johnson on Truckhouse Life. In fact, there's a few things that he helped me with. And I mean literally helped me. Because in case y'all didn't know, me and him are like best friends. We've known each other for the last 20 years. And just for the record, I built my cabin before he had built anything. So maybe he modeled his truck cabin off of my cabin, which I'm modeling my truck cabin off of his truck cabin, which was modeled off of my original cabin. So basically, I'm stealing my own ideas. Anyway, I'm just messing around. The point is, we're good buddies. He helped me with a lot of it. I owe him a lot. And yeah, I definitely copped some of his design stuff on here. In case you hadn't noticed, fall was definitely in the air. That got me thinking about getting this wood stove installed ASAP. So I started fitting the chimney with the wings that would support it to the roof, and from there I'd be able to frame out the box for where this will exit through the ceiling. These roof support kits come in pretty good handy. They're adjustable to any different pitch of roof, and if you put the framing in right underneath it, they really create a solid lock for that chimney. A lot of pressure can sit on your chimney if you're in a snow area. All that snow that sits up on top of your roof comes down onto the chimney, and if you don't have something really holding it structurally in place, it's probably going to bend or just break right off. So this was a cool trick that I figured out. You need to cut a hole in your roof that matches the chimney, which seems easy, right? Like you just trace the chimney. But when it's at a pitch, it's not just a circle. It's going to come out like an oval or an elliptical. And you have to figure out just how wide that's going to be based on the pitch of your roof and how wide the chimney is. So I used this piece of stovepipe trim as a template to stretch it out. So I just made my clearances on all sides 2 inches, and then it made me a perfect elliptical, which I was able to transfer up to the roof. I figured I better have this thing weighed before I dug any deeper down the rabbit hole. If it was too heavy for the axle already, there was no way it was going to be ready for the road by the time everything was finished. So I took it to a local weigh station to see where I was at so far and how much allotment I had left to finish the interior.
Okay, 3,360 pounds. That's not bad.
3,360 pounds. What a relief to know that I have about 2,000 more pounds to add to this thing before I'm anywhere near overloading the axles. I started by using 1/2-inch pieces of plywood to create a makeshift jamb around the inside of the door. I figured it would make it look cleaner and also give me a nice flat surface to work around, ensuring that I had good edges to get this door to fit into. The first bit of head scratching was just figuring out what I was going to make the door out of. I thought about sandwiching together various pieces of plywood and foam and framing, but the problem is that most doors need to be between 1 3/8 to 1 3/4 thick. That's the size that all the typical handles fit and a lot of the hardware is designed to go with. And there's not a whole lot of different combinations of plywood and framing that makes between 1 3/8 and 1 3/4, but it just so happens that a 2x6 laid on its side is 1.5 inches. So I figured if I could combine some 2x6s laid flat, that would at least get me my thickness. I do owe a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's helped me out with this project so far. Whether you lent me tools, let me use your warm garage space, park in your yard, or just spent the day framing with me. You know who you are, and I just want to say thanks. After it was all done, I let it sit for 24 hours and then came back to remove the clamps. The fact that it didn't immediately fall apart when I took the clamps off, to me, was a sign of success. This is the kind of woodworking that I was talking about that makes me really nervous. Getting things exactly perfect with a door is really important so that it fits in these tiny, tight little clearances. And using a chisel and a hammer, it's like, man, this is just not my skill set. But I managed to take my time and make it work. And I have to say, I actually really enjoyed it. I look forward to doing more of this stuff in the future. With the door itself completed, it was time to figure out how to fit this thing in. I used some scrap wood to cut out a couple of door shims to keep it sitting at the right height. Alright, this is the moment of truth. So you just gotta shave down this bottom edge here. In case you hadn't noticed, it's winter here in Alaska, which means that the temperature is usually always below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and today was no exception. So I had to find a glue that was able to set in really cold temperatures. I found this stuff by Liquid Nails that said it was good from 0 Fahrenheit all the way up to 100 Fahrenheit, so I opted for that. The problem is that the stuff was really thick and plasticky, so it was actually hard to get the different woods to seat tight together after I put the glue on because of how thick it was. All said and done, I'm pretty pleased with the way this door came out. I'm not finished with it yet. I still want to do some decoration on it and maybe stain it and add trim, but for now its functionality is exactly what it needs to be. Strong, weather-tight, and able to open and close with ease. This, of course, is a huge milestone with this build because that means that I can start working on the inside with the comfort of heat. Speaking of heat, I'm sure you guys have noticed that the inside has been insulated since the last episode. It also just feels warmer because it completely knocks out any air leaks, and it also removes the need for a vapor barrier on the inside. This was a no-brainer. Just like in my main cabin and my bunkhouse, I decided to use click-together Pergo flooring. It's waterproof and relatively easy to install once you get the hang of it. Well, I cut the wrong side, but luckily I can still just cut the same board, but now I gotta cut it again. Okay. For the interior siding, I'm using a tongue and groove cedar board that's only about a 1/4 inch thick. This is going to make it much lighter than your typical 1 inch or 1/2 inch thick. The only thing about these boards is that they're so thin that the tongue on them tends to break really easily, and they're really not designed to go over top of studs. They're meant to go over drywall or some kind of flat surface. But they're surprisingly inexpensive considering that they're cedar, and they're going to look and smell amazing when they're all done. Cutting these pocket angles can be pretty tricky for a 612 roof pitch because your typical chop saw doesn't have a steep enough angle on it to cut them. So instead I just made a template and then cut it out with a circular saw by hand. There's very few things that I find more satisfying in life than stepping back and staring at something that you built with your own two hands. I have a hard time imagining that there's anybody out there who enjoys cutting a hole in their roof, especially when you took so much time to make sure it's waterproof and buttoned up real good. But it had to be done in order to install the wood stove, so I used this Sawzall with a metal cutting blade to cut through both the plywood and the sheet metal on top, which is actually a lot harder to do because the blade doesn't really want to turn, so I recommend drilling a lot of pilot holes instead of just going for it like I did, which resulted in a really uneven cut. These silicone roof boots do work really well for keeping the water out, as long as you don't do one thing, and that's cut your hole too big for the size of the boot. And in this case, with my shoddy Sawzall work, I ended up just barely being able to stretch the silicone boot over the hole that I'd cut in the roof. Glad to have that done. You never want to start your wood stove for the first time inside. There's a bunch of chemicals that need to cure off in the paint, and so the stove itself will smoke and smell really bad. So I always make sure to get a good hot fire going outside and let all that junk burn off before I bring it inside.
That's close.
I want to give a shout out to the guys at Northwoods Fabrications for making this stove. It's a really affordable stove. It was only like $400 or $500 I think, and I have to say it's built with really good quality. The model that I went with is the Woodsman, which was the perfect size for this 12x8 cabin, and you can find it online at northwoodsfab.com. Since it's just a really simple steel box stove, I decided to add some fire brick on the inside to make sure that things didn't get too hot on the outside, and I also think it'll help preserve the steel over time to keep it from warping and cracking. Another added benefit of the fire brick is that it turns the stove into more of a slow release than just an instant hot and instant cold. The fire brick really helps hold on to the heat and distributes it at a slower, more comfortable pace. After a quick test run in the cabin, I decided I wanted even more fire brick in the stove. It wasn't quite filled all the way because the bricks didn't fit, so I got a chisel out and made them fit. If you find yourself cutting fire brick, make sure to wear a mask because the powder that comes off of it is supposedly pretty nasty. In a tiny cabin, fitting a wood stove can be tricky, so a heat shield is pretty much going to be necessary. I use these porcelain spacers that are designed to do this, but you can use all sorts of different stuff, like copper tubing or cork. I've heard lots of different things. The material that you use for the heat shield itself just needs to be something that's non-combustible. It doesn't actually have to be like fireboard or anything like that, just a thin sheet of metal, because the actual physics of the heat shield is all about having an air gap behind it. It's not so much that the thing itself is insulative, it's that it keeps an air between the combustible materials and the stove, and that's what keeps the wall cool.
Timmy, you want to help me? So this line is going to go right in line with that.
Good.
I picked up this slat bed design from YouTube, and I watched quite a few different people make it and picked up some good tips from some of them. What's cool about it is that it functions as a couch and a bed. So when you have it pushed in, it sits there as a couch, but you can pull it out and make a full-size bed, or in my case, a 49-inch bed. A full size is 54 inches, but I just didn't have that much space considering I needed to fit a kitchen and a dinette in here as well, so I cut it down to 49 inches. One of the best tips I picked up from other folks who've built this bed was to add a washer underneath the boards that go on the sliding piece. This keeps it from catching up on the framing from the stationary piece and makes the bed go in and out really smooth. Let's see here. Clearly I was going to need something to keep the slats from falling through the bed that wasn't going to be so thick it could be felt underneath the mattress. Perfect. But now I needed something to make sure that the slats wouldn't pull all the way out and fall off the framing altogether. So I added another piece on the underside to stop that from happening. So I've never built anything that resembles furniture, but for this build I needed to customize everything down to the inch in order to make it fit in this tiny space. So I set to work on building this dinette. I was pretty happy with how these 2x2s started to take shape. I just made sure to pre-drill every joint and add wood glue as well, so that way I had some kind of strength other than the screws that were holding it in. Another great tip I picked up from a fellow YouTuber was using these 1x3s as trim pieces around the 2x2s. That gives an inside edge that you can secure something else to. And in my case, I happen to have a bunch of leftover cedar tongue and groove siding. And I'll admit, I think it looks pretty dang good for being as simple as it is. Of course, anytime you find yourself with a void in a camper like this, it's important to turn it into some kind of storage. So I figured the easiest way to access these boxes would be to put a couple hinges on the seats so you could store things like cookware or food or blankets for the bed. now that the benches are finished, it's time to do the kitchen. And this is going to be tricky because I had to figure out a way to custom fit the oven that I had, the battery-powered fridge that I planned to use, the damaged sink that I got for free, also find some space for a countertop, and a couple of cupboards to keep things in as well.
Shoot. Dang it. This outlet is in the way. Dang it.
Problem solved. I did lose access to one of the outlets, but it's not a big deal because the only reason I have this outlet down here was to plug in my rechargeable refrigerator. The more pieces of wood that you try to join together on a single corner gets exponentially trickier because there's more and more screws going through where you might need the next one to go. But with enough pilot holes, eventually I did find a way to make this work.
And a quarter.
There's actually a lot of considerations when it came to picking out a mattress. I needed something that I could cut to size since no mattresses come in a 49-inch, so obviously foam was going to be the only option. And then the question is how thick a foam and how firm a foam. And I found this 5-inch foam mattress. Technically it's for children, it says, which I'm assuming just because it's 5 inches instead of like 7 or 8 inches. It doesn't maybe support as much weight as other mattresses would, but I think it'll be perfectly sufficient for this. I needed to clean up around the edges of the windows before I could install the sills and the trim, and unfortunately I made a pretty big mess when I used the expanding foam to fill in the gaps. I also had a really hard time getting the Grace Ice and Water Shield to come unstuck from the sill. That stuff really does do a good job of locking into the wood. I can see why it's so popular for the roof. As we all know, finish work really isn't my strong suit. But these turned out okay. I think with a little bit of grain filler and some sanding, I can make the corners look a little bit better. It's so hard to anticipate every single step that's going to come later on. Like when I put this outlet in, I really wasn't thinking about how far the trim was going to stick out from the window and thus interfere with the corners. That stuff's just really hard to think about unless you've done this a lot of times. But that's what the multi-tool's for. After cutting the seat flush with the rest of the bench, it was time to move on to stain. Again, I'm not really too familiar with many stains, so I did some research and decided that Danish oil would be a pretty good one for me because it's hard to screw up. You just apply it to the wood, and you don't have to worry about brush strokes or direction of the grain or anything like that. I ended up doing about 3 or 4 coats before I called it good.
Shoot.
Speaking of things getting in the way of other things, this piece of trim now makes it so my seat doesn't open all the way. Oh well, that's why they make multi-tools. I used big lag screws to attach these into the wall studs, and a couple of long 2-inch screws to attach them to the floor as well. Rather than cutting the mattress into 2 separate pieces, I decided to see if I could just score the pivot point to make it so it would fold up into a couch and then fold down into a bed, with still being just one single piece of mattress. Worked like a charm.
Ha!
And it was then that I realized I had screwed up yet again. I really made the bed too high. My idea was to put storage underneath it, but when you sit on it like a couch, your feet dangle and it's not comfortable at all. So I decided I was going to need to go ahead and shorten the bed. This required cutting all the legs, uninstalling it from the wall, and dropping it down to a new level point. The only problem was that doing this by myself actually turned out to be a lot harder than I thought, and the bed dropped on top of me and I got stuck underneath it, and it was a whole fiasco. And of course my camera battery died right at the beginning of that process, so I didn't get any of it on film, but just know it was a gigantic pain in the butt. So for future reference, it's important to know that a good couch height is about 15 inches, and that needs to include your mattress. So I built mine to 17 inches and then put a 5-inch mattress on top of it, which is why it was way too high to be comfortable and have your feet sit on the ground. I actually chose the width of my door specifically so that I could get this oven through it. It's important to think about those things before you start building, otherwise you're going to end up with a problem on your hands later on. Kind of like how I did right here.
Shoot. Dang it. Oh. Oh, shoot. Stupid.
I measured the overall width of the stove from the back, but it turns out there's these little nubs at the top that stick out another ½ inch on either side, meaning that I was going to have to trim down the opening on this.
Woo!
Like in my main cabin, I decided to use a sanded plywood for the countertops. This particular one was birch, and it was a little bit more pricey, but I thought it would look nice and hold up better.
Haha. Oh yeah. Solid as a rock.
For the refrigeration, I decided to use the Glacier fridge by EcoFlow. It's the same one that I have out of my cabin, and I've been really impressed with it. You can charge it up, and it'll last for about 2 or 3 days on a single charge. You can also power it with solar, DC, or AC, so I thought it'd be a perfect fit for the cabin. I've included a link down in the description. I wanted more counter space than my kitchenette had to offer, but I didn't have enough room without interfering with the bed. So I decided to build this little bump out so that the counter would go farther, but the bed could still fold out to its full width.
Here we go. Pulls it from the cup, no problem. Why is it not pulling it from there, no problem?
Just got to figure out how to make that hose stay down flush at the bottom of the can. Maybe it'll straighten out overnight. Well, spoiler alert, it didn't straighten out overnight. However, I did learn that in order to get vinyl tubing to straighten out, all you have to do is put it in boiling water, take it out, and lay it somewhere completely flat and let it cool. And then it will hold its shape as a straight hose. Problem solved. All right. Cool. It's not a bad counter. It's just not gonna do. It's just not gonna do. I just wasn't satisfied with this countertop. It looked okay, but there was little imperfections in the top from the framing underneath it not being perfectly level. It also had frayed edges, the look wasn't quite right, and I forgot to make overhangs so that the doors wouldn't stick out past the countertops when it's all done. Yep, this is gonna be way nicer. The Danish oil worked well for the other furniture, but for a countertop you want to use something that's got a lot stronger top coat. So I used a polyurethane finish and did 4 coats of that as well. It came out glassy smooth. Works pretty good. Having a spare bed in a cabin like this can really come in handy. You don't want to have your buddy cozying up to you when you're on a hunting trip. I realized that having all my plumbing drain into a bucket underneath the sink would be fine for my cabin, but not so good for a mobile cabin. I kind of just wanted the water to be gone once I was done with it. That way you didn't need to empty the bucket every single time you got on the road. I'm also really crunched for space, so this was going to open up a ton of cabinet space to have that bucket out of the way. So I found this adapter that goes from a sink basket to a garden hose and right out the bottom. Don't worry, I don't plan on putting anything through that sink that would be bad for the environment down into the ground. I use biodegradable soaps, and water is pretty much the only thing that's going to go through it. When it came to making the doors for the cabinets, I had to call in the big guns. My wife is much better when it comes to tiny little details than I am, and she's actually had a little bit of experience doing cabinet work with her dad growing up.
Alright.
Won't open.
But even the pros make mistakes. So away she went with the chisel to try to make this door open a little bit wider. Now, if it was me, I would have just taken a hammer and beat the whole thing to the ground. I don't have the patience or the know-how to try to figure out how something's getting stuck and then carefully adjust it so that it'll work. But a lot of her strengths just happen to be my weaknesses. So we make a pretty good pair. I was able to find ultra heavy-duty cabinet latches at the local camper store. I'm so glad to have that place. They've had all sorts of little things that I've needed that you'd never be able to find at a normal box store.
Hey!
I started to get a funny feeling in my stomach, like the end is actually getting near. This thing was actually going to be done and ready for camping like really soon. All I had to do was finish up this cabinet door that my wife started for me, and of course I managed to screw that up too.
Dang it. Fixed it. All right.
One final step before I was ready to take this thing on its maiden voyage. I needed log posts for the porch, and I happen to know exactly where I could find some. And there it was. It was done. Well, kinda done. Of course, there's always something left to do. I still needed curtains and upholstery. I needed to finish up some more exterior siding once it warmed up enough to use the stain that I like. So of course calling this done isn't quite right, but it was done enough to get up in the mountains and do some camping. First I needed to have it weighed to make sure that I hadn't exceeded the coupler rating or the axle rating on my trailer. If it was over 5,000 pounds, I was going to have a big problem. That meant I was going to have to cut off the coupler and have a new one welded on, and if it exceeded 7,000 pounds, I didn't even know what I was going to do. I had a tremendous amount of anxiety while I waited for those numbers to come in from the weigh station. And then there it was, 4,420 pounds. Hallelujah, we are under the 5,000 pound mark with it all done. That's with the water, the wood, the propane, everything fully loaded. It was ready to go, and I couldn't be more happy about it. This thing was actually going to tow okay. Not only that, I was able to figure out the tongue weight was 540 pounds, which is exactly 13% of the total, which is going to be perfect. I know it looked a little bit tongue heavy, and a lot of people were pretty skeptical about how that was going to pan out, but it turns out it's just perfect. Now that I've taken this out on a few trips, I can safely say it far exceeded my expectations in just about every category. It tows better than I thought, it's insanely comfortable, the wood stove keeps it really warm, and it's just exactly what I wanted, a cozy cabin. So just remember guys, that if a hack like me, with scrawny arms and no building experience growing up can build something like this, so can you. So set your sights on what you want your world to look like and go get it. I'll see y'all on the next episode of Alaska Cabin Adventures.